Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Brooke Hartman.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
Hey, great. Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming on. Can you tell me a little bit about your writing?
I love writing fun books for kids. Currently, the books that I have published are all picture books. I have dabbled in other forms of writing like young adult, fantasy. But when I started having kids several years ago, they're now a little bit older, that sort of story format started getting condensed down and down into a picture book style format. And that ended up being what was first published, and it's just taken off. And that's what I do.
That is fantastic. Can you tell me a little bit about your most recent book?
My most recent book is called All Aboard the Alaska Train. It is a super fun, rhyming, interactive guide to riding Alaska's train and also meeting the animals that live there. So the story itself is basically you are rhyming your way through Alaska on the Alaska Railroad. And as you round the corner, you spot an animal. It gives you some rhyming clues about what that animal is. And then the animal in the illustrations gets on the train. And so by the time the book is halfway through or 2/3 of the way through, you've got all these fun animals that have boarded the train. And in that time, you've kind of learned a little bit about those animals that you might see while riding the train. And at the end, there's a super fun back matter that tells you more about the Alaska Railroad. It tells you where all that train has gone in that journey because it gives you little clues as you go along, but then you get to actually see a map at the end that shows the full journey of the Alaska Railroad from the most southernmost station to the northernmost station. Gives a little history on when the Alaska Railroad started and why. And then there's a super fun train diagram too. So for any lover of animals, trains, all of the above, I think it's just a perfect fun book.
That is fantastic. What interested you in writing about the Alaskan train? You live there, right?
I do. I actually live up here in Alaska. I was born and raised. I don't just write about Alaska. I have a lot of books that have more commercial appeal that are not regionally themed. But my mother was a trainer for the tour guides on the Alaska Railroad. The Alaska Railroad is kind of unique in that way, in that as you ride it, there are actually tour guides that get on the intercom system and tell you a little bit about the sites that you're passing, or if there's an animal on the side of the train tracks, what that animal is. And so I grew up with the train and riding the train with her. And then now my brother is a lineman for the Alaska Railroad, which means that he goes up and down the train tracks and checks and makes sure that they're clear, fixes anything. And so a lot of family history with the Alaska Railroad. And I felt between the rhyming aspect, because I've written a lot of other rhyming books, the animal aspect, I've written some other Alaskan animal books as well. And the train aspect, it just seemed like a perfect fit.
That is so cool. I'm from Chicago, and our trains definitely do not have tour guides that tell you about the wildlife while you're riding the L.
Right.
That is just so interesting, though. So I want to talk a little bit more about this rhyming element.
Yeah.
When did that come into the picture for you? Is that from the beginning or something that happened naturally?
So in general, I have been writing in rhyme since I was probably in the first grade, just writing little poems. Loved that feel of that meter and that wordplay and rhyme. And then as I got older, driving my teachers nuts because they would assign some essay on some very serious topic. And I would write like a rhyming poem about it. And I'm sure they were like, huh, but that was just me. Like I just couldn't help myself. And so I do have some picture books out. I have 7 picture books that have been published, and only 2 of them are not in rhyme. The rest are all 100% in rhyme. So
That's so cool. I relate I'm a poet, so the
yeah,
writing stuff, I'm like, yes, all I
has
would
to have that like lyrical feel to it.
defaults. Hmm.
Mhm. Now
How
with the Alaska Railroad book, I also wanted to get that feeling of being on a train with the meter. And so if you want, I can read like a little snippet of it just so
I would
you
love
can get
that.
that feel. Okay, so for instance, on one page it says, chugga, chugga, clickety clack, rushing down the railroad track, under stony cliffs so high, around the bend, what do you spy? From rocks so steep, they take a leap. Those curly horns belong to, and then the answer is sheep, as you look on the next page and you see the dull sheep jumping down from the cliffs. Um, but I wanted to get that like board momentum feel, that chugga chugga, the onomatopoeia in there as well, so that as you're reading, you get that sense of like being on that train track and those wheels going. So
That so much. How do you figure that out? Do you take it and actually scan out the meter for things in the rhyme scheme, or is it more based off of feel for you?
it's 100% feel. I think about how I want to format a book a long time before I sit down and write it. And by a long time, I mean like maybe a few weeks or something like that. But before I ever sit down, I have an idea. Before I ever start writing something on that idea like that, I have to have a feel that comes into my head, and I have to have a few stanzas that I'm like, okay, this is the feel for that book. And then I'll start kind of penning some ideas down or penning some stanzas down for how I want it to sound on paper. But I've got to get that feel going through my head first.
So when you write it, do you write all at once, or do you take breaks, come back to it?
Yeah, I tend to write in chunks, not necessarily from um, because that's how I think it should be written for me, but because I don't have a lot of time during the day to sit down in chunks of time to write it. And so I tend to have, this section, and I'm going to write this section down, and then, oh, time's up. So then I have to come back tomorrow or a few days later. And then, okay, where was I? Well, maybe I'll edit a little bit of that and then I'll work on the next section. And it'll take me a few weeks or so to get that first draft down at least. And then I will send it to my critique group. They'll tell me, hey, this stinks. No, or they'll tell me, oh, it's great, except for these few parts we were a little confused about, or maybe you want to alter this. And then it's back to the drawing board, and it might go back to them again, depending on how extensive those suggested edits were before I show it to my agent.
Interesting. Now, I'm also curious about this next part of the process. Illustrations. What was that
Mhm.
like working with the different illustrators?
So this illustrator, John Joseph, has also illustrated another book of mine called The Littlest Airplane. It's a super fun, also rhyming story about a bush plane, which they're very popular up here in Alaska. But that has a lot of national and commercial appeal as well. So John Joseph has illustrated several of the Little Blue Truck books, actually.
I saw the book cover for the
Yep.
Little Airplane. I was like, have I read this book? I
Hmm.
know because it must have been. I think it was those. I
Feel.
was like, I feel like I remember one being about a truck.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely his style. And so for him, this book just felt really natural because he does that those machines so well. Like he gives them
Mhm.
like their own character basically. And then he also does animals really well, and he does people. He just does a fabulous illustrator. So he's wonderful to work with. The biggest hurdle with, interestingly enough, because he lives in Colorado and these were Alaskan animals. And so I saw the sketches for everything and I was like, this looks fabulous. And then I saw some of the colored sketches, and for the sheep, he had them colored like bighorn sheep. And I was like, okay, we don't have bighorn sheep in Alaska. We have Dall sheep, and they're white. So he was like, oh, I didn't even, you just think sheep, like, it must be bighorn sheep. All right. And so we had to go back and change that. And then he also, I didn't realize until like my second glance through, I was looking at the kind of side animals, and I was like, wait a second, there's a raccoon in this picture. And he's like, yeah, I thought it would be cute. And I'm like, oh, it's adorable, but we don't have raccoons in Alaska either. So
Oh,
I was
really?
like, yeah, no raccoons. So it was just little things like that for the authenticity, because a lot of these books, there's been a really broad appeal nationally for this book. We've already sold quite a few copies nationally.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's gone out in like I believe it's the Literati book box. Um, it's a great national appeal, I think, because the train and the animal element, but then it's also sold locally for the tourist market and for the local market, the local gift
And
market as
it has
well.
great educational appeal too with the back.
Right.
Like
Back
it's a
matter.
no-brainer. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's been fun too, but I wanted to make sure that it had a very authentic vibe to it, and wanted to make sure all that was right.
I love that you went through and really made sure that those details were there because that's the kind of thing that can really make or break any book, but especially
Yeah,
a children's book when it's so visual and you're looking at it and you're going to get kids that are from Alaska that are going, I don't have that
exactly.
here. That's not what it looks like when I look out my window or I look out from
Exactly.
the train.
Hmm.
So, kind of switching things up, I want to talk about your reading habits, specifically when you were a kid. Can you tell me a little bit about your favorite books when you were young and how that influences what you write today?
Well, interestingly enough, I first of all, I loved picture books when I was younger, and that love continued even as I got older. Just the classic picture books. My one of my favorite picture book creators was Chris Van Allsburg. I did
Oh,
love the Polar Express, but Mysteries of Harris Burdick was hands down my favorite picture book. And if you haven't heard of that, I would strongly
mhm.
suggest going and getting it. It's a little bit creepy. So if you have a kid that gets scared easily, don't recommend. But the premise for this picture book is that there was this mysterious author who showed up in an editor's office one day and said, "Look, I had all these things that happened to me and I wrote them down and let me know what you think." And then this author mysteriously disappears. And so
I've read
each
it.
page is a different illustration with a caption, one sentence caption of what is going on in this illustration. And how the story is supposed to go is completely left up to the reader. And so I had teachers in elementary school that would use this as a writing prompt
Mhm.
book because all you're given is this little caption for what these illustrations, and some of them are a little bit scary. Like one of them is called Under the Rug, and it shows a man and he's lifting up a chair to smash this bump that's under a rug, and you don't know what's under the bump. It's just this bump that's under this rug. And so it's like, ooh, is it scary? Is it a nice thing? And like, you don't know. And then there's this cool illustration of kids skipping rocks at a lake. And the caption is, and on the third skip, the rock skipped back. Or on the third throw, the rock skipped back,
Oh,
or
that's
something
such
like
a good
that.
writing prompt.
Yeah. And so you're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Is the rock magical? Is there a fairy? Like, I mean, you don't know. Your brain just flies off the handle with all these crazy story ideas. So I just loved that. I was one of those overly creative kids, always lost in my own imaginative world. And so things like that really inspired me to write my own stories later. And then, of course, I read lots of novels. I read Wrinkle in Time, like Madeline L'Engle is one of my favorite authors. One series that not a lot of people know about these days, but it's a great middle grade series, is called So You Want to Be a Wizard. And I love Diane Duane wrote those, Diane Duane. And those have held up really well and are super fun. And there's even an early laptop that gets used in these. And these were written in like the late 90s.
Mhm.
So she was being very imaginative. And then here we are, like this would totally hold up these days because, of course, she's using a laptop. Why wouldn't she use a laptop? But back then it was like, whoa, she has this computer that she can take with her. Like, how'd she do that? So it's those are another really fun series that if anybody has any middle schools out there that is middle graders out there that you're looking for a new series, check those out.
That is awesome. Thank you for the recommendations.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself writing in that sort of middle grade area at some point?
Maybe middle grade. I'm not sure if I at heart am a middle grade author. Maybe one day it will surprise me and I will come up with this middle grade story. For some reason, my writing, even though I read a ton of that middle grade growing up, my writing tends to be either for the younger ages 4 to 7, 4 to 3 to 8, realm with picture books. And then I do have a couple of young graphic novel story concepts that I have been, I even have one that's with my agent that we're kind of finagling to try to get it
Interesting.
where it's just right. And then I've got these upper YA, either fantasy or thriller kind of that are definitely not for that younger audience.
Mhm.
So I don't know why I write that. It's just that's the stories that have so far come to mind. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now
That
in my
is
writing.
so cool. Yeah, and kind of on the same subject here, I'd like to know a little bit more about how you started writing.
I like I was saying earlier about writing little poems and things like that as a kid, that just continued as I got older. And I did not think about writing to with the idea of getting published until probably my early 20s. And then I had this story concept for a young adult fantasy novel that never got 100% finished. It did actually have an agent at one point in time, but then my gears shifted toward picture books and that started taking off, and I haven't really looked back. I haven't had time to. Like, this momentum of picture book publications has really been carrying me forward, and it's a super fun journey, and I want to see where that takes me. But these other projects do keep calling me every once in a while.
Mhm.
uh, but yeah, I suddenly started writing more often, and then looking into it um, as more as something that maybe something could come out of my writing one day. And so the biggest recommendation I would make to anybody who is looking to write to get published is to, while you are first writing your first draft, like before you get too far down that journey, join a local writing group, join SCBWI if you are a children's author, from either board books up to young adult. Like SCBWI is your people. Find maybe some Facebook groups even that are for writing for whatever genre it is that you are trying to write in, and get a better idea of what that process is going to look like for you. Because what sometimes happens when we write is that it's such a solo process that we tend to go down this road by ourselves, and suddenly we have this novel and we're like, yay, I'm done. And then you're like, now what do I do with it? And then you're trying to find that community, and you realize, oh, whoops, I made some mistakes while I was writing that I didn't know I was making while I was writing. And now you have to go back and kind of repeat the process. Whereas it would be much easier if you had already done all of that while you were
Mhm.
starting that writing journey.
And I think also finding your people early is really important
Hmm.
because a lot of the time when you're writing, it's like, especially when you're first starting out, you can go, I am going to create this whole thing and it will be perfect on the first draft.
Yeah.
I am guilty of this, but
Uh-huh.
it'll be perfect on the first draft and I'll write it all by myself and then I'll like unveil it to people and
Hmm.
it's like, oh, but
That is not how it
it's
works.
not great and
Oh,
you need
wait.
to keep
Yeah.
working on it and
Yeah.
it's good to have that community and support and input from the start.
When I do my author visits for schools, I spend a whole like a 3 slides on the number of edits that I have done for just my picture books. And
Mhm.
we count like the number of saved files that I have of each version. And that's just the versions that maybe the editor from the publishing house has sent me. So that doesn't even count the ones that I did before it ever got to that point, like with my agent or on my own with my critique group. And then we have a big discussion about, who are the editors in your lives. And so why are your teachers or your parents or whoever it is telling you, maybe we might want to change this part, maybe we want to fix the spelling on this part? It's to make our writing better. It's not because they don't like you, it's not because they don't like your story, it's because they want to make your story better. And I think instilling that feeling early is really important, because there's this thought that like we have to be perfect, like everything we do has to be just right, as opposed to it's okay to make mistakes because we can work on this together, and we can make it better together.
And I'm also of the opinion, I'm not sure if everyone is, but I feel like if I turn in a project to someone and they don't give any notes, I take that as a bad sign because I'm like, well, then it can't get better. But that doesn't mean
Yeah,
it's good.
right.
It means that like I want to find things to improve, and
Yeah.
I think that's a good lesson to instill early on.
Yeah. I have gotten to the point with my critique group. We have been meeting almost once a week since 2012.
Oh wow.
So we now know each other, and there's no, the sandwich method where you have to tell something nice and then
Oh
you
yeah.
give your feedback and then you end with something nice. There's none of that. That's completely thrown out the window at this point in time. We just go for the jugular. But I kind of, and I don't want to say enjoy, because we never enjoy when somebody says, hey, you did something that you have to fix. But you can feel your story getting better when they have this discussion. Like you can literally feel it. And that's what I really enjoy, is that feeling of your writing this project, like improving to the point where you're like, I could now see this, I can envision this as a book now. So that part
Yes.
has been really fun and rewarding.
And I think it's also really exciting in those editing stages when you hear people using the language of your book to
Hmm.
describe things for you and getting passionate about certain things and
Right,
caring enough to give notes and
right,
to help and make it better and you can feel it improving. Like there's something exciting about it.
right. And the other piece of advice is that sometimes when we are in critique groups or receiving critiques, we hear the feedback from other people that, oh, you should just listen, like just sit there and listen. And I would tend to disagree with that, because in our critique groups, when somebody says, hey, I didn't understand this part, I think maybe you need to do this, I ask questions. I'm like, hey, if I tried this, would that help you understand it? Or at what point did you not understand this? And do you have any ideas for how I could fix that? Because I think that the discussions that my critique group has had around fixing things has helped me more than anything. Because sometimes when we're getting that feedback, we might read it as, oh my gosh, I have to totally rewrite this, when all it would take is two words mentioned in a sentence at the beginning of a paragraph and it fixes the entire thing. I mean, that's not always the case, but sometimes it is. And so having those discussions around how to make your writing better, I think is a vital part of that critique process.
For sure. For sure. So a little bit more about your process. What do you do to get into the headspace for writing and like what does that look like for you?
It looks like me finally having so many words in my head that I haven't had a chance to write on paper, that by the time I finally get that paper up, it's there. I'm just dumping words onto the page. Because as I mentioned earlier, I don't have a ton of time during
Mhm.
the week to write. I have a day job, and then I have two younger kids that are still requiring lots of mommy supervision and time, and chaperoning mostly at this point.
Mhm.
So I get to a point where in my head, or maybe in the notes app on my phone, I use the notes app on my phone a ton. If I'm driving around and suddenly I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to include this part, or I forgot I need to edit that part, or I've got a good rhyming feel or stanza or rhyming word that I can use for this one section. And I'll use the dictation feature on my phone to maybe write that down if I'm walking, or whatever it is. And then so later I'm literally cutting and pasting a lot of that, or I'm dumping what was been in my brain spinning around all day long. And so getting into the process isn't usually that hard for me, because by then I'm like, okay, finally I get a chance to do all this. What sometimes interestingly is hard for me is when I get feedback from an editor
Mhm.
after I've sent that initial project draft to the editor, and they come back, and that this is going to be the toughest part of the revisions, is that first look where they're like, okay, we might have to have you change an entire stanza. Oh, we want the character to do this instead, but you have to rhyme it. And it's like, oh, that's going to be interesting. um so sometimes I, even without even opening the notes from the editor, or with barely glancing through it, I send the whole thing to my critique group, and I'm like, tell me what you think. And then for some reason, that time lapse and then that filtration through my critique group coming back, like, helps me process it. And I'm not quite sure why, but then after they talk about it, I'm like, oh yeah. And then I can go back and like have this fresh set of eyes on
Yeah.
the feedback that the editor has given me. But for some reason, like I tend to kind of wall up when I see all these notes on the side of my manuscript. It's almost overwhelming. Whereas when it's filtered through, when I start to work through the process with my critique group, I'm like, okay, yeah, we can do this.
That totally makes sense. And that first moment, I'm currently dev editing.
Yeah.
So that first moment when you open it, it's like, oh, what have I done?
Yeah. Seriously. You're like,
And
wait, never mind. I don't want to publish this
and
book.
it's like I'm
I
turning and
take it back.
burning it away.
Yeah.
But well, what I found helped me was just to look at every page, not even read the notes, but
Hmm.
look at every page. And I was like, okay, there's a page that didn't have a note on it. We
Yeah.
got one. It's okay. And that made me
Yeah.
feel so much better seeing like it's not all of it. It's not a
Right.
note on every line. You're okay. Yeah, but that writing group thing sounds so helpful for that for
It's
sure.
very helpful. And what's interesting with my writing group is that I am the only picture book author in it.
Oh,
Yeah. And I tell people that, I mean, that's not true for every writing group that could have the same dynamic, but we have a middle grade fantasy author, we have a young adult paranormal author, we have an adult romance, serial romance author, and we have a queer fantasy author. So, but what I tell people why this works is that a story is a story. And if things don't make sense to a reader, they don't make sense to a reader. So it doesn't matter what format that's in. It doesn't matter if it's a queer fantasy. It doesn't matter if it's about an Alaska picture book about Alaska train. If you are reading something, it should be able to make sense and you should be able to feel what the author is trying to tell you. I mean, because we're all adults and at this point in time, like that should be clear no matter what you're trying to write. And so that's how it's worked, is that we critique everything based on the story and what the author is trying to get across.
I think that's a great approach because then you get such a better view of things from all these different
Mhm.
angles. And
Mhm.
it's not just like parents, there's also people that are other family members that want to buy the book for their kid or
Mhm.
like for someone else's kid or something like, or even then it's the parents and they like reading queer fantasy books
Yeah.
and they have all of these other interests and you're targeting those readers too and they're looking
Right.
at like, oh look, a book about the Alaskan train, that's
Yeah.
so cute, it's a good story, my kid
Right.
can read this.
Yeah. It's been a very interesting dynamic, but it's worked out really well. So
Mhm. Well, I've had such a great time talking with you today. Thank you so much for coming on.
thank you. This
I
has
just
been
have one
awesome.
I just have one more question, and that's what do you have coming up?
So I have 4 books under contract. And honestly, I've lost track of what is coming out next, but I believe the next book that's supposed to be released either end of this year or beginning of next year is called Cute Animals That Could Kill You Dead. And it
Amazing.
is it's super fun. It is a hilarious, punny, nonfiction picture book about adorable animals around the world that are either severely like toxic, venomous, or have a strong predator drive. So for example, like there's the sea bunny in there, which we're like, oh, a sea bunny, and it's actually highly toxic. So it's like, don't go petting any sea bunnies. And then of course we have like the poison dart frog in there,
Mhm.
and there's something called the black-footed cat, which is this tiny little cat that's smaller than a bag of sugar. It's the smallest cat in the world, and it kills more animals a day than like leopards or lions or cheetahs. So
I
like the amount of
still want
animals
this
that it,
cat though.
yes, right. It's like this like small but fierce. So the book is all about that. It's illustrated. The illustrations are hilarious. And I cannot tell you how much time I spent researching animal puns and jokes to go into this book. So the whole thing is just like this fun, punny, like there's tons of little jokes in there. There's additional information on each page about things like where the animal lives in the world, whether it's endangered or not, that sort of thing. It's a really fun project, so I'm excited about that.
Oh, that sounds incredible. If you ever want to come back on the show, you are welcome back on. I'd love to talk
Sure.
about I would love to talk about that book. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It was great to chat with you today.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Brooke Hartman.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after.
The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.